Wow. Thank you. Thank you, choir, and thank you, everyone, for joining in. You know, there was a group of, is it time?
No, they're ahead of you.
Okay. Whew. I thought thought I was in the wrong spot for a moment. I'll start again. There was a group of Swedish researchers that studied choirs, and they studied group singing. And they found that when we sing together as a choir, or that when we sing together as a group, that as our voices begin to harmonize with one another, our breathing and our heartbeats also begin to line with one another. Our breathing and our heartbeats become synchronized. There's this old cliche where sometimes we'll tend to say something like this: you're just preaching to the choir, or they're preaching to the choir, or we're preaching to the choir. Whoever first said that underestimated the power and the importance of the choir. The power of bringing our voices, our breathing, and our heartbeats together. Now, this part of the service we usually refer to as the sermon or the message, but I want you to consider that today's sermon and message began very early on today. It began when the choir reminded us that we all are part of the Justice Choir. The sermon continued when we sang together, "Spirit of life, come unto me, sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion, blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me." Perhaps when we sang that today, because the song has become so familiar, perhaps we've sung it together often enough for our heartbeats to align with one another. I'm sure it did in the last song that we sang together. But I don't know about you, but when we're singing Spirit of Life, when we get to those lines, blow in the wind, rise in the sea, roots hold me close, wings set me free, that I see a flock of birds in my mind's eye. Maybe they're sparrows. Maybe they're starlings. Maybe they're a flock of geese in V formation. And you may know this about geese when they're in a V formation, but they'll rotate who's at the peak of that V to make sure that nobody gets too worn down, that they share the load, that they support one another. We are all members of the Justice Choir, giving life the shape of justice. And I join Adrienne Marie Brown inviting us to consider that giving life the shape of justice requires murmuration and motion. It requires relation and relationships. Or as she asks us to imagine, strategic flocking. And I think for us in this room, us in both congregations, us that are Unitarian Universalists, or maybe those of us that are Unitarian Universalist adjacent, there are maybe those of us that are still exploring whether this is our chosen faith or not. That's okay. There are those of us that just enjoy being in UU spaces and feel a sense of alignment and connection, but never really see ourselves entirely as UU. But we still all come together, right? That I know for myself that I attended a UU church for a long, long time before I ever started to think of myself as UU. But here we are. Regardless of whether we consider ourselves UU or not, here we are gathered together in person and online. We are a people who gather together. We gather together to learn together. We gather to affirm what we value, what's important to us, what we hold most dear. We gather to build community and create this human experience of church. We gather in service to others to act towards social justice and collective liberation. We are a people who gather. And there was a time that I took this for granted, that it didn't really strike me as particularly unusual or unique, because I was raised in a different faith tradition and was part of a church family. And so I just thought, yeah, this is what churches do. Churches just get together. That's what church is about. Whether they're UU or not, that's just what churches do. But over time, I came to realize that it's really not that simple. About 6 years ago, I was driving down the road and I was listening to a talk radio show. And they were talking about the fact that the Catholic Pope, Pope Francis, had made this statement that the radio show hosts just found completely startling. That according to Pope Francis, you didn't have to believe in God in order to get into heaven. That atheists would be welcomed into heaven if they lived a good and meaningful life in which they had helped others. You might remember when he said that. It created a little bit of a stir and some controversy in some churches. Not so much in ours, but in some churches. And the radio talk shows, this radio talk show, the hosts, they were just completely startled. And I remember them asking, well, if that's the case, why bother going to church? In their minds, the purpose of church was to avoid hell and earn a place in heaven. And so if anybody could pretty much get in with a little bit of effort, why bother? Why show up? But the statement that Pope Francis made wasn't that far removed from the beliefs of the early Universalists at our roots. They were believers in universal salvation, that all are saved, that all of us are loved. And yet, those early Universalists continued to gather. They gathered in gratitude, they gathered in fellowship, they gathered in community. And so while we as contemporary Unitarian Universalists may not believe in exactly the same way as those early Universalists, we've expanded into a much wider range of interpretations and ideas and beliefs about what is sacred and what life beyond this life may hold. But we continue to carry this spiritual and religious heritage as people who gather in love, gather in gratitude, gather to celebrate with each other. And those roots run deep. As far back as 1648, our Unitarian forebears wrote this document called the Cambridge Platform. It was the principles that governed the New England Unitarian churches at the time. And it still has influence. Even if we've never read it, the DNA is still there, right? Because our forebears stated in the Cambridge Platform that we gathered by voluntary agreement, consent, and covenant to form a visible church. And they would write, the communion of churches is exercised by way of mutual care and taking thought of one another's welfare. communion of churches is exercised by way of mutual care in taking thought of one another's welfare. I've been thinking about that recently as we've been preparing for this service and bringing our two congregations together. I think it's very relevant for us that here we are, two congregations who are gathered together in mutual care of one another within our congregations. It's something I've learned about each congregation, how important that is within the congregation. And mutual care between the congregations, something we're in the early stages of. But that's there. That thinking was there when I first started meeting, even with the search committee. It was evident that there was thought about one another's welfare. And while that might have felt a little bit out of the box, those roots run deep in our faith and in our heritage. And so while some of the world's really great and wonderful religions focus on individual spirit and individual soul, one of the things that's unique about our faith and our tradition, who are Unitarian Universalists, that we share a belief in our interconnection with life and with one another. And while we certainly do grow as individuals, our spiritual calling is to one another, to community, to collective liberation, to being in the justice choir, to be murmuration in motion. It is in our heritage. It's our spiritual DNA, and it's in the songs that we sing. Ours is an aspirational faith, and that continues to grow and change. It's a living tradition. And as we gather in this thing that we call covenant, these promises that we make to ourselves and to one another for how we will be together to make the world a better place, we do that to contribute to something greater than ourselves. And there are times when we're honest with ourselves. This, as I said, this is aspirational. And so there are times that growing into being human and growing into a beloved community can be difficult and challenging. I know the first part of this message, I was making it sound very poetic, and it is, and it's also challenging. And we sometimes fall short. We fall short of our values, and we fall short of our aspirations. Right now, UU congregations around the country are currently reflecting on what our collective promise will be, what our collective covenant will be, and how we'll word that now. We've changed the wording many times over the years as we think about who we are and where we are at this moment and where we're going. And that's the Article 2 that folks have been reading and thinking about. But one of the foundational steps in that process, even prior, was this report. You can tell I'm the son of a reading teacher, right? Because I'm always like, you should read this. This report was done in 2020 by the UUA's Commission on Institutional Change, and it's aptly titled Widening the Circle of Concern. And this is available as like a free download. You don't have to get the hard copy, but I like to feel a book. But this widening the circle invites us to face what can sometimes be an uncomfortable truth, that we're not always as welcoming as we aspire to be or we envision ourselves. Not without taking time with intention and with intentional practices. That being human in a wider world means that we often start to mirror the types of harm, particularly towards marginalized peoples and communities, that's present in our larger society. We're part of a larger society, and we absorb some of that. So for some of this, when we read that or hear that or we talk about our congregations and our faith in that way, it can sometimes come as a little bit of a shocker or surprise because our own experience may have always felt welcoming and always felt like one of belonging. And it's like, I haven't experienced that at all. But for others of us, saying that out loud comes as a very firm affirmation of experience. And continue to gather, and you use places and spaces, even when we have those shortfalls, even when we struggle. Within this document, within this call for widening the circle, there's an invitation for us to make 3 commitments, 3 intentions, 3 kind of strategic flocking approaches. One, that we recommit ourselves to the aspiration of being fully inclusive and being an anti-oppressive community. That we recenter the truth-telling that comes from voices that are at the margins of our faith community. And affirm, always reaffirming that we're leading from a position, from a covenant of care, the care that binds us. And those commitments can't be done individually. They have to be practiced in community. They require a depth of relationship. We are a people who gather with intention. We gather as part of a living tradition that is growing and changing, a journey into human wholeness and toward collective liberation, and in which together we create a community and communities of belonging based in dignity, equity, and justice. That is our murmuration. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.